As I stated earlier, we had missile bases along the Front Range. NORAD was 80 miles away in Colorado Springs. Lowry Air Force Base, which developed film for satellite reconnaissance, was 60 miles away. The Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which manufactured nerve gas, was 40 miles away. Rocky Flats, where they manufactured atomic weaponry, was 40 miles away. And Denver became sort of a hub for the military-industrial complex. Now, with all those people working for the government around, it was natural that many of us went into or examined the possibility of going into government work. Plus, it was our patriotic duty to kill Russians and stay ahead of them in the space age race or space war, whatever the hell they called it. They segregated high school classes and put us in various tiers and designated that these tiers were going to be this, that, or the other. So my group were designated to be scientists and engineers, and that's the way we were treated and how we were structured and how we were indoctrinated. If you wanted to study something like English or poetry or writing or music, tough shit. We needed scientists. My cousin, a couple of years behind me, was a physicist who got his PhD at Cornell University and was involved in high energy physics. A lot of my classmates became physicists, chemists, etc. I ended up, contrary to my father's wishes, at University of Colorado, which was like pulling teeth. But I didn't study what I wanted to study. I started out there, since I didn't want to be an engineer, in the pharmacy school, thinking science would placate him. What I really wanted to do was study music and things like that, maybe languages. In any event, it didn't take me long to figure out that pharmacy wasn't for me. And I withdrew from University of Colorado because I was bored and confused and generally screwed up all around. And in order to piss off my father, I enrolled at University of Denver in the music program there and studied French horns, which just really annoyed him. So at that point, I was cut off, period. No more money, no more funding, etc. Well, I got even. I took some of my cattle and sold them. They were mine, but he treated them as though they were his and wanted his permission given for anything I did with them. So to exercise control, I sold them, shipped them off to Denver. And just for good measure, I took some tools out of the barn and pawned them in Denver and sent them the pawn ticket. That was pretty crucial to our relationship, I suppose, although we did sort of make amends later. As a result of that, I realized I'd probably never go back to school, at least on any terms that would be acceptable to me. I started playing trumpet with a few bands on Colfax Avenue in Denver then, and wasn't making ends meet, or barely making ends meet doing that. And I didn't want to work menial jobs, so I took the money that I had left and enrolled in barber school, which was quite a revelation. Looking back, reflecting on it, that was probably the best training somebody could get to be a lawyer other than bartending. Um, it was quite an experience. It was on what they called at that time Skid Row, and our customers there were what they called winos. And I learned a lot about people, and I learned that there, but for fortune, go a lot of us. Everyone had a story that came in there. Many of them were former veterans from the Korean War and later conflicts. They'd sort of been ignored by the government. They lived down there because they could afford it, and they cashed their checks there because the bars on Colfax, or excuse me, on Larimer Street, were amenable to that, and also bar tabs. And it was just very, very interesting talking to all of these people, learning about them, learning about their backgrounds, and things like that. That was one of the main factors that caused me to eventually study sociology and want to be a social worker, because I thought these people were neglected and they needed help and they needed somebody to advocate for them. And it was fun. Plus, I was hanging out with a lot of interesting people then, writers, and a few people came through town and stopped at the boarding house I was staying at, and I met a lot of the pranksters and people like that. There was a place in Denver called My Brother's Bar that wasn't too precise on ID checks, and I used to hang out there occasionally, along with the coffee shops and things like this. It was a really interesting experience. And by the time I finished barber school, I had also attended extension school in Denver and studied introduction to sociology there and some English courses and other courses. So I had a few credits when I decided to go back to Boulder to go back to CU. At that point, I determined I didn't want to be a musician. That was a dead end. But I was really inspired into sociology, and that's what I ended up majoring in and studying for a number of years. And in fact, I've studied it off and on constantly since 1960. I've taken many graduate courses at University of Colorado and elsewhere. I've had many hours in social theory, social conflict, and of course criminology and delinquency. I even taught in the criminology division of the sociology department upon occasion, taught upper division delinquency, and got involved with several dissertation committees in the area of social policy, generally referring to the criminal justice system. One of my students wrote his dissertation on the concept, social construction of the term bikers, another one about street prostitution in Denver, another one about drug policy and fomentation of drug policy, another one on domestic violence. So I got into some esoteric research and learned a lot that way also. So I could say that my life's been pretty much a continuing education since I started working. So when I moved back to Boulder in '61, I think it was, and worked in a barbershop there, it was very interesting and revealing, the same as it was in barber school on Larimer Street. I met lots of people. I got involved politically and academically. Many of the customers that came into the shop were graduate students and college professors. The shop I worked at, the boss had a doctorate in linguistics and was an Italian professor at one time. and wanted children and couldn't make enough as a professor, so he went back to barbering. He was from Connecticut and had gone to Chapel Hill, North Carolina for undergraduate and graduate school. A lot of the linguistic or language professors came in the shop there, and I worked on them. And found out, interestingly enough, that the Naval Language School at Monterey was set up by one of the French professors in the department. The other thing that happened is I had many students in sociology, criminology, and a few professors there. And actually cutting hair was almost like a seminar for me in graduate studies through the brief conversations that I've had with the professors there. When you think that you can sit a whole semester in a course and maybe get one or two questions answered, depending on how big the class is, and you had exclusive time with a professor of maybe 4 to 10 minutes, having a professor in your barber chair for 20 minutes to half an hour was quite a lot of professor time. And I got a lot of questions answered, had a lot of interesting debates. And the shop was actively a debate center or political center where a lot of things happened. One of the things that did happen, one of the things that advantaged me, was an advantage to me, was that I became president of the Barbers Union in Boulder, and on the adjunct to the Colorado Labor Council, which was a very interesting learning experience for me too, because I worked with other union people and other workers and had a sort of worker's perspective on issues. One issue I can remember was the issue of workers in Boulder. Boulder had sort of an elitist mentality. Their public relations thing is the portrayal of Boulder residents and Boulder itself as the People's Republic of Boulder, which is very misleading. It's not the People's Republic at all. It's pretty much bureaucratic and run by government people, and spooks, a lot of spooks in Boulder. The city admittedly was prejudiced against blue-collar workers. They had an ordinance, or rumored to have an ordinance, that it was illegal to carry a lunch bucket in Boulder. There was a section of town that had an impoverished population, including some blacks and Hispanics, and they legislated that away by putting in a brief freeway between downtown and a new shopping center on 28th Street called Canyon Boulevard, and they were able to move all the low-cost housings out of town, or pretty much so. This was sort of my launch in my political career and my professional career. When I decided to go to law school, well, I'll back up here a little bit. I was taking graduate courses at University of Colorado, working on a different plan there. And because of my work schedule, I couldn't work on the honors program, which I was disappointed, but I had to make a living somehow. The interesting thing was that at this time they were tinkering with degrees, with 5-year master's programs, skipping masters, going directly to doctorates, things like this. So I was taking graduate courses and doing quite well, but I was also active in politics, what people would probably call left-wing politics. I call progressive politics. It didn't matter. I was pro-labor, pro-union, And at that time, there was a big debate going on between a guy named Alex Garber, who was a socialist, and Ed Rozek, who was conservative. And Rozek ran for regents. Barry Goldwater was running for president. President Kennedy had just been assassinated, and things were up in the air. Coors started up a conservative think tank. The student paper had a rival called the New Conservative because Coors et al. Thought Colorado was still a hotbed of communism, although annoyingly it was a hotbed of spookdom. So we had all kinds of political activities, debates between the left and right. Fair Play for Cuba was being attacked by the conservatives, and various other things were going on. And University of Colorado became sort of a hotbed of all kinds of wild and crazy, even fun things. In any event, I got real active in organizing teachers' unions and things like this, and labor activities in general. One of the things that I was really lobbying hard for was accreditation of various apprenticeship programs at the state prison. They had a significant barber school there, and you had prisoners going to that school for years and not being able to get licensed after they got out because it was a penitentiary. There was also non-accreditation of some college courses and things like this, which I thought was very foolish because what you were doing is avoiding setting some of the prisoners up for failure. So that was my political activism at that time, which led me into a few problems. And I was just getting ready to get organized for a PhD program when one of the advisors called me in and explained to me that I could stay there until I was eligible for Social Security, and I wasn't getting a doctorate in sociology because of my political activity. So that route was closed to me. Meanwhile, my wife was bugging me to do something else. She said, why do you want to waste your time as a social worker? You can do much more good if you go to law school. And I'd been admitted to a few law schools, so it looked to me like I was going to have to move somewhere. I didn't want to apply at University of Colorado because of the stigma of political activity, and it was a pretty conservative place then. So I trotted off to Chicago to go to law school, and never regretted that, except for the winters there were fierce. I'd never experienced such cold. And when I was in law school in Chicago, it was a real interesting place. I hung out at the Old Town School of Folk Music. I met Phil Oakes and some of the radicals, Chad Mitchell. I was active in the anti-war movement. Also worked a little bit with the Black Panthers and had a lot of fun. I edited the law school newspaper rather than go on the law review because I thought it would be more interesting, which it was. I was the first law school newspaper to come out editorially against the Vietnam War, and won an award beating out Columbia University Law School publication, which I'm still very proud of. But I also met a lot of journalists there. I met Mike Royko and some of the anti-war people, and people from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois that were student activists. I got active in the civil rights movement. I marched with Martin Luther King in Cicero and did all kinds of fun things. In fact, if it wasn't for the political activity, I probably wouldn't have finished law school. because I found it pretty boring compared to graduate school. And a lot of my classmates weren't particularly bright, but it was still fun and interesting. And law fascinated me, particularly the historical aspect of it and the sociological structure. In fact, for the last 15 years or so, I've been working on a textbook of sociology of law, but just haven't had time to get back to it. Anyway, that's what it was like in the initial years of my career. When I got back from law school to Boulder, I had sort of a ready-made practice because being a union head gave me an entree to clientele, and most every male in the county, even though they had hippies cropping up then, knew barbers, and most of the barbers knew me, and I got a lot of referrals from. So I got a head start on the practice. Additionally, there was a lot of classmates of mine when I was going to undergraduate school that were pretty bright, and they formed sort of a social club. They called themselves the Fuchs, and they were kind of intellectual delinquents, and I knew many of them. In fact, one of my roommates at the boarding house was one of their leaders. So I got referrals along those lines, and that started me off on the long track of being a criminal defense and constitutional lawyer, which I'll go into later. But the main purpose of this series is to sort of augment and comment on changes in law since the advent of Richard Nixon, and everything changed then. So the next item will be the drug policy changes and how that changed our whole concept of jurisprudence during that period of time from Nixon on. And I'm going to try to compare the structure and function of the criminal justice system under Johnson and the Great Society to that of Nixon. And I hope I get a few more comments. I hope I get a little bit of encouragement on this. It's sort of a personal history thing, but I hope it's relevant to the situation going on today from at least a little different perspective. Thank you, and if you could refer this video to other people, I would really appreciate it. I would like to build my audience as much as I can. So please like my video and please share it with others as much as you can. That's all for now. Have a good day.